This is the story of something that really happened. Something so unsettling, it still sends chills down the spine when remembered. It began on an ordinary afternoon when a young man named Ravi moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. The building was old, with peeling paint and creaky stairs, but the rent was affordable, and the area seemed quiet, almost too quiet. Ravi had just started a new job and needed a place that was simple and cheap, nothing too fancy. This little corner apartment felt like a fresh start. After a long day of hauling boxes, arranging furniture, and setting up the basics, Ravi stood in the middle of his new home, satisfied. The sun was setting, casting orange light across the tiny living room. He had just sat down to rest when there was a faint creaking sound coming from the hallway outside. Thinking it was just the building settling, he brushed it off. But when he went to close his door for the night, he caught a glimpse of someone watching from the slightly open door across the hall. It was a man, tall, thin, maybe in his late 30s. His face was half hidden by shadow, but his eyes were unmistakably fixed on Ravi. There was something strange in that stare. Not curiosity, not welcome, just cold, quiet watching. Ravi nodded politely, the way people do when acknowledging a neighbor. The man didn't respond. He just slowly closed his door without a word. Ravi's hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment longer than necessary before he shook off the discomfort and locked up. Over the next few days, the man next door made his presence quietly known. Every time Ravi stepped outside his apartment to take out trash, to check the mailbox, to grab groceries, he would feel eyes on him. Not always directly, but there was always that sense of being seen, being studied. Once, as he returned from work, he found the neighbor standing in the hallway, completely still facing Ravi's door. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, and for a moment it looked like a statue had come to life. When Ravi passed him, the man tilted his head slightly and smiled, a slow, wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was no introduction, no small talk, just that eerie smile. Still, Ravi tried to be reasonable. Perhaps the man was just awkward, maybe lonely, maybe even socially anxious. Everyone had their own way of existing in the world. He told himself not to jump to conclusions, but then little things began to happen, things Ravi couldn't explain. One evening, he returned from work and noticed that his front door was open, just a crack. His heart skipped. He was sure, absolutely, sure that he had locked it before leaving. He always double-checked. Inside, nothing seemed stolen or out of place. Yet a strange unease clung to the apartment, like the air itself was whispering that something had been disturbed. Another night, while lying in bed, he heard footsteps. Not above, not below. Right outside his window. His apartment was on the first floor, facing a small, overgrown garden area. No one should have been walking around there at that hour. He waited, holding his breath, but the footsteps faded into the night. The strangest moment came on a Sunday morning. Ravi opened his door and found a candy bar placed carefully on the doormat. Not just any candy bar. It was a rare brand, one he liked but rarely bought. Taped to it was a small note, written in neat handwriting. "I know you like these." A cold shiver went through him. How would anyone know that? He never mentioned it to anyone. Not at work, not online, not even to friends. It was just one of those personal little things. His mind went to the cameras in stores, to online data leaks, to weird coincidences. But deep inside, he felt it. That neighbor. He knew. Somehow, he knew. Ravi started keeping his windows locked at all times. He moved a chair in front of the door at night. Sleep became light, uneasy. The tiniest creak or gust of wind would jolt him awake. And always, always, he felt like he was being watched. One afternoon, while heading down the hallway, he accidentally dropped his house keys. As he bent to pick them up, the neighbor's door creaked open a few inches. Through the crack, one eye stared at him, unblinking, just watching. Ravi stood slowly, heart pounding, and stared back. The eye disappeared. The door closed silently. That was the moment he stopped making excuses. Something wasn't right. He didn't have proof. No laws were being broken, not yet. But the feeling was undeniable. There was something deeply wrong about the man next door, and this was only the beginning. As days turned into weeks, the unsettling feeling that had crept into Ravi's life became something far more sinister. The man next door, with his empty stares and quiet smiles, remained a constant presence, always seen, never heard. But it was the nights that truly began to wear on Ravi's sanity. It began with faint noises. At first, he thought it was just the usual creaks of an old building, the size of wood shifting as it cooled at night. But these sounds were different. They weren't random. They came with a strange rhythm, always at the same time, around 2 or 3 in the morning, just when the world outside had gone silent and the only sound was the faint hum of streetlights. Tap, tap, tap. It would begin as a light knocking on the wall shared with the neighboring apartment. Soft, almost polite. But what made it disturbing was its pattern. 3 taps, pause, then 3 more. Night after night, the knocking returned, as if part of a dark ritual. Ravi tried to ignore it. He pressed pillows over his ears, played music softly in the background, and even moved his bed to the farthest corner. Nothing helped. The tapping always found him. And it wasn't only the sound, it was the feeling behind it. There was an intelligence to it, a presence. One night, frustration overcame fear. Ravi, half asleep and angry, slammed his fist against the wall where the knocking came from. A moment of silence followed. Then, without hesitation, the same tapping came back, mimicking his exact rhythm. He froze. Every hair on his body stood on end. That wasn't just noise from pipes or walls. That was someone, something, responding. In the darkness of his room, Ravi sat up and stared at the wall, unable to move. His ears strained for the next sound. Nothing came. Only the silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Sleep abandoned him entirely. The next morning, he tried to convince himself it was a coincidence. Perhaps the neighbor had also been awake and decided to play some strange joke. Maybe it was a bizarre coincidence, a moment of shared insomnia. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of that eye staring at him through the door crack. That afternoon, he ran into the neighbor again. The man was standing by the mailboxes, smiling. Always smiling. His head tilted slightly as if amused. He looked directly at Ravi and said, "We have thin walls, huh?" Then, without blinking, he leaned in closer and whispered something that made Ravi's blood go cold. "I heard you breathing last night." There was no laughter in his tone, no sense of joking. The words were said softly, almost tenderly, as if spoken to a lover rather than a stranger. Ravi didn't reply. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped past the man and rushed back to his apartment. Once inside, he locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat in the middle of the room, shaking. That night, the tapping didn't come, but the silence felt worse, like something was waiting, watching. A few nights later, it returned, but different this time. The tapping was no longer from the wall. It came from the window. 3 slow taps. Pause. 3 more. The same rhythm. Ravi's apartment faced a small overgrown garden. No one had reason to walk back there, especially at night. He crept toward the window, heart racing, and peeked through the edge of the curtain. Nothing but darkness. But he felt it, like eyes staring back through the glass. Terrified, he stayed away from the window for the rest of the night. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in the corner with a kitchen knife in hand, flinching at every creak and sigh the apartment made. From that night on, the sounds came from different places. First the wall, then the window, once even the front door. Always the same pattern. Tap, tap, tap. Robbie stopped trying to sleep. He stopped going out unless he had to. His face grew pale, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Every knock on the door made his heart leap. Every shadow felt like it moved just a little too long. One evening, while brushing his teeth, he saw something that nearly made him scream. The mirror in his bathroom fogged up slightly from the hot water, and in that fog, just for a moment, was a small handprint. Not his. It was too small, too perfect, and placed higher than his own hands ever reached. When he wiped it away, it vanished. But something inside him broke that night. He began to question everything: his mind, his sanity, even reality itself. The neighbor's strange smile, the tapping, the whispers, the handprint, all of it swirled in his thoughts like a storm with no center. He called the landlord, asking if there had ever been complaints about the man next door. The landlord only laughed and said, "He's been here a long time. Quiet type, pays on time." When asked if anyone else had ever lived in that unit, the landlord's tone changed. "Yeah, few did. They didn't stay long." Ravi hung up, without another word. He began keeping a journal, writing down every sound, every odd thing. The entries became longer, messier, more frantic. The same phrase repeated more and more as the days passed. "He's trying to come in." Whatever was happening, whatever the neighbor was, it wasn't just a man anymore in Ravi's mind. It had become something else, something dark and patient, something that didn't knock for attention but to wear him down. And it was working. By now, Ravi barely left his room. The lights stayed on all night. The curtains never opened. And still, the tapping came. Tap, tap, tap. Like a heartbeat from the other side of the wall. Like a message that said, "I'm here, I'm listening, and I'm getting closer." The weeks dragged on, stretching Ravi's nerves to their breaking point. The unrelenting tapping, the eerie whispering, and the creeping sensation of being watched had seeped into every corner of his life, making every waking moment a battle against his own fear. Sleep was a distant memory, and his work suffered as he barely mustered the energy to drag himself to the office each day. The once ordinary apartment had become a prison, and the man next door was no longer just a nuisance. He was a terror, a shadow that loomed over every moment of Ravi's existence. But what Ravi didn't know yet was that the worst was still to come. One afternoon, when Ravi returned home from work, he noticed something different about the hallway. The air felt heavier, as if something had changed, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The usual creaks and murmurs of the old building were absent, replaced by an unsettling silence that settled around him like a thick fog. His heart raced as he walked toward his apartment door, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. As he reached for the doorknob, a low, guttural sound echoed from the hallway behind him. Ravi froze. It was the neighbor's door, slightly ajar. But it wasn't the faint creaking of the wood that unnerved him. It was the sound of something scraping along the floor, a rhythmic dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the room. Ravi's breath caught in his throat as his mind raced. What could it be? His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The noise continued for a moment, and then there was silence. Slowly, Ravi stepped toward the door, his heart pounding with each step. He couldn't resist. He had to know. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut. The air smelled stale, like something had been locked in the room for far too long. Ravi's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound. And then he saw it. The neighbor stood at the far end of the room, facing the wall. His back was hunched, his arms at his sides, and there was something in his posture that sent a wave of nausea through Ravi's stomach. The man wasn't moving, but there was something unsettling about the stillness. It was like he wasn't even alive, just a mannequin, frozen in place. The scraping noise had stopped, but Ravi could still hear his own pulse in his ears. The silence stretched on, suffocating. Ravi felt a sudden urge to flee, but his body refused to move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the man. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And then the man spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried clearly across the room. "You've been listening, haven't you?" Ravi's blood ran cold. He wasn't sure how the neighbor knew he was there, but the words seemed to hang in the air like a warning. The man's head tilted slightly, and Ravi could just make out the faintest of smiles curling at the edges of his lips. It wasn't a pleasant smile, but something darker, something twisted. "I've been waiting," the man continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "I've been waiting for you to understand, but now it's too late." Ravi's instincts finally kicked in. His body surged into motion, slamming the door shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls. His breath came in sharp gasps, and his legs felt like jelly as he backed away from the door. What had just happened? What had he seen? He couldn't make sense of it. The scraping, the man's strange posture, the words that seemed to echo in his head. Ravi stumbled toward his own door, fumbling with the lock, desperate to escape the suffocating tension that clung to the air. The apartment felt too small, too close. As he collapsed onto his couch, trying to catch his breath, his mind raced. He had to know what was going on. The neighbor wasn't just odd or reclusive. He was dangerous. There was something wrong with him, something far darker than Ravi had ever imagined. Over the next few days, Ravi began to take more drastic measures. He stayed in his apartment, barely leaving for anything but work, and even then, he felt like the walls were closing in around him. The tapping came every night without fail, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like the sound was coming from inside his own skull. But it wasn't just the noise that unnerved him. It was the feeling that followed it, the feeling of being stalked, of being hunted. Every time he stepped outside, he felt the heavy weight of unseen eyes on him, watching from the darkness. One evening, as Ravi returned from work, he noticed something that sent a fresh wave of terror through his body. The neighbor's door was open, not just ajar, but wide open, as if inviting him in. He stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to convince himself it was a coincidence. But deep down, he knew better. He had to face the truth. The neighbor had been waiting, and now, Ravi was the one who was trapped. Against his better judgment, Ravi found himself at the threshold of the neighbor's apartment once again. His mind screamed at him to turn away, but his feet carried him forward, step by hesitant step. He was drawn to the door, compelled by an unseen force he couldn't resist. The door creaked open on its own, and Ravi's eyes darted around the room, taking in the strange, suffocating atmosphere. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that Ravi couldn't recognize. And in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was the neighbor. This time, his face wasn't hidden by shadows. His eyes were wide open, staring straight at Ravi. There was no smile this time, just an expression of pure, unfiltered madness. His hands were covered in something dark, something sticky that Ravi couldn't identify. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, his voice more distorted than before, as if the words were being dragged from some dark, twisted place. Ravi's body froze. This was it, the moment he had feared. Whatever this man was, whatever he had become, it was too late to turn back now. Ravi's mind raced as he stood frozen in the doorway, unable to tear his eyes away from the neighbor's gaze. The man's eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and his smile was gone, replaced by something darker, something that sent a shiver down Ravi's spine. The air in the room felt heavier, like it was pressing in on him from all sides, and the silence between them felt suffocating. Ravi's instincts screamed for him to turn and run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move. The man didn't blink. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, looking at Ravi as though he had all the time in the world. Ravi swallowed hard, his throat dry. The words the man had spoken echoed in his mind, louder now than ever before. "You shouldn't have. Come!" Ravi's heart thudded painfully in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He had to leave, but the door seemed miles away, and the air was thick, heavy with a presence that made his skin crawl. The apartment, once ordinary, now felt like a tomb. Everything in the room seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though the very walls themselves were alive. Then, just as Ravi was about to turn and flee, the man took a single step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The floor creaked under his weight, and Ravi's breath caught in his throat. The man's voice, when it came, was soft, but it carried an undeniable edge of malice. "You've been listening, haven't you?" the man asked again, his tone almost affectionate. "Listening to the tapping, to the scratching, to the whispers in the dark? It's been so loud, so persistent, hasn't it?" Ravi's mind whirled. His legs began to shake, but he couldn't look away. It was as if some invisible force was holding him in place, preventing him from running. The man continued to advance, step by step, his eyes never leaving Ravi's. "Do you understand now?" the man asked, his voice growing colder with every word. "Do you understand what's happening here? What I am?" Ravi could barely breathe. He wanted to scream, to run, to tear himself free from this nightmare, but his body refused to obey. He had to know what the man meant. What was happening? What was he? The man stopped just a few feet from Ravi, his figure looming in the dim light of the room. A sickly sweet scent filled the air, and Ravi's stomach turned. The man's skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes had a strange gleam to them, something far too knowing, far too unsettling. "You think I've been trying to get your attention, don't you?" The man's voice lowered to a whisper, and his lips curled into a smile. "But it's not you I've been after, Ravi. It's not you at all." Ravi's pulse raced. He didn't understand. What did the man mean? What did he want? The man seemed to know everything, had been watching him for so long, and Ravi was starting to realize that he wasn't just dealing with an insane neighbor. He was dealing with something far worse. "I've been waiting," the man continued, his voice almost sweet now, like he was speaking to a child. "Waiting for someone strong enough to survive the tapping. Waiting for someone who could hear the sound of the scratching, the whispering in the walls. And you, Ravi, you heard it. You listened. You survived." The words felt like a slap to Ravi's face. He had thought it was just some bizarre occurrence, some strange coincidence that he couldn't explain. But now it was clear. It was all by design. The tapping, the scratching, the whispers in the night. It wasn't random. It was all meant to draw him in, to pull him deeper into whatever twisted game this man was playing. Ravi took a shaky step back, his mind racing. He couldn't comprehend it. He had to get out. But the man moved forward again, faster this time, his hand reaching out toward him. "No, no, no," Ravi shouted, finally finding his voice. But it was too late. The man's hand gripped his wrist with an iron-like strength, pulling him into the apartment with a force that was beyond human. Ravi struggled, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as the man dragged him deeper into the darkness of the room. For a moment, Ravi thought he might break free. He yanked his arm, trying to pull away, but the man's grip was unyielding. The air around them seemed to thicken, and Ravi's vision blurred. His mind screamed at him to escape, to fight, but his body was no longer his own. The man's touch felt like fire, like it was burning through his skin. "You're not going anywhere," the man said softly, his voice almost tender now. "Not anymore. Not after everything you've heard." Ravi's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold floor. His vision swam, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in around him. His body felt heavy, like it was being dragged down into the ground itself. The man loomed over him, his eyes filled with something that resembled pity. Ravi tried to push himself up, but it was impossible. It felt like the room was sucking him in, pulling him toward some unseen pit. He tried to scream, but his mouth was dry, and his voice wouldn't come. He could only watch helplessly as the man moved closer, his face inches from Ravi's. "It's all been leading to this," the man whispered, his breath hot against Ravi's ear. "You heard the tapping. You listened. Now it's time for you to understand. You've been chosen, Ravi. You've been marked." The words echoed in Ravi's mind, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The tapping, the scratching, the whispers. They weren't just sounds. They were a signal. A signal to draw him here, to bring him to this moment. And now that he was here, there was no way out. "You're mine now," the man said, his voice almost soothing, like he was giving Ravi a gift. "And I've been waiting so long for you to understand." Ravi felt his body go limp, his mind surrendering to the darkness that had been creeping in around him. He had fought. He had tried to escape, but it was all futile. There was no escape from this nightmare. He was trapped in the man's world now, and he had been chosen to become a part of it, whether he wanted to or not. And as the last of his strength drained away, the tapping that had haunted him for so long began again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside his own mind, growing louder and louder until it consumed everything.